A friend cut ties and tried to evict me from my house, so I sued him and his wife for everything. It's been 3 years since Mike and I stopped talking. 3 years that felt like both a lifetime and a blink of an eye. Back then, I never thought we'd end up like this, estranged, barely even recognizing each other's existence. We had been inseparable once, practically brothers, bound by years of shared experiences. College roommates, road trip companions, and late-night confidants. We had built a friendship that seemed unshakable. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and ours didn't survive. Mike was the one who ended it. He didn't sugarcoat his reasoning. According to him, I was a bad influence. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and to him, that was a glaring red flag. He claimed I couldn't understand the responsibilities of fatherhood, and for that, he didn't want me around his family. It felt like a slap in the face, a dismissal of everything I thought our friendship had been. At first, I thought he was joking, but the cold, serious look in his eyes told me otherwise. I didn't argue with him that day. What could I say to a man so convinced of his own logic? My lack of children didn't define me, but it seemed to define me in Mike's eyes. I wasn't irresponsible. I had simply chosen not to start a family yet, focusing instead on surviving the ups and downs of life. But Mike was done. His mind was made up, and I had no choice but to walk away. The timing of his betrayal couldn't have been worse. My father had recently passed away, leaving me reeling with grief. My dad had been my anchor, the one constant in my turbulent life, and losing him felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I thought Mike would be there for me the way I had been for him when his mother passed. I had sat by his side at the hospital, helped him sort through her belongings, and supported him through every tear and angry outburst. I had been there for every moment of his pain, but when it was my turn to grieve, he was nowhere to be found. He didn't even come to my father's funeral. For months, I tried to make sense of it, to find some justification for his behavior. But as silence stretched between us, I realized that Mike had been pulling away long before that final conversation. By the time I needed him most, he had already decided I wasn't worth his time. It hurt more than I cared to admit. 3 years passed without a word between us, and I had made peace with the loss of our friendship. Or at least, I thought I had. But then, out of the blue, Mike reached out. It was a message, short and direct, and I almost didn't recognize the number at first. He explained that their house had been damaged in a water heater explosion, and they needed a place to stay while it was repaired. He painted a picture of desperation, medical bills piling up, their budget stretched thin. He even threw in a comment about how he'd heard I was the kind of person who helps people in tough situations. I knew exactly where that line had come from. A year ago, I had taken in some friends of a mutual acquaintance, Kate. Her brother and his wife had been through hell. A car accident had left them both in comas for weeks, and when they finally woke up, their lives were in shambles. Their own mother had kicked them out, unwilling to deal with their recovery. I had stepped in without hesitation, offering them my spare room until they could get back on their feet. They had shared their story on social media, and apparently, Mike had seen it. Now, he was using that act of kindness as leverage, trying to guilt me into helping him. But this wasn't the same. Kate's brother and his wife hadn't abandoned me when I needed them most. They hadn't dismissed me as a bad influence or turned their backs on me. I stared at Mike's message for a long time, conflicted. I had the space. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment, and taking them in wouldn't have been a logistical issue. But the nerve of him to ask after 3 years of silence, after all the pain he'd caused, it was almost laughable. I responded with a simple no. No explanation, no apology. Just no. I thought that was the end of it, but I should have known better. Mike wasn't the type to take no for an answer. A few weeks later, another message arrived. This time, he claimed their house had electrical issues and was unsafe for the kids. Once again, he asked if they could stay with me. His tone was more urgent, his desperation more apparent, but my answer didn't change. I reminded him of his own words, the ones he'd thrown at me like daggers 3 years ago. If I wasn't good enough to be part of his family then, I certainly wasn't going to be their savior now. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we could have had. I thought maybe he had finally accepted my decision, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Mike was desperate, and desperation has a way of bringing out the worst in people. Mike's persistence didn't surprise me, but his audacity did. When he reached out for the second time, claiming his home's electrical system was faulty and dangerous for his kids, I decided to turn his logic right back on him. I told him plainly that I didn't want children in my home indefinitely, his or anyone else's. It wasn't about the physical space. It was about my emotional and mental boundaries that I had every right to uphold, especially after what had gone down between us. His response was immediate, and even though it came in the form of short, clipped texts, I could feel the heat of his anger through the screen. He accused me of being selfish, rattling off reasons why I should help him. He brought up their mounting medical bills, the stress of being unable to afford a hotel, and the supposed danger his family was in. It was a classic guilt trip, one I'd seen from him before, but this time I wasn't falling for it. Mike had already shown me who he was years ago when he turned his back on me during one of the hardest times in my life. I wasn't going to invite that toxicity back into my home. It wasn't just about the principle, though. Something practical had started nagging at the back of my mind. After Mike's first request, I remembered a conversation I'd had with a friend about tenants' rights in our state. She had mentioned that if someone stayed in your home for more than 7 days, they could legally claim residency. I wasn't a legal expert, but the idea of Mike's family moving in and potentially staying indefinitely made me uneasy. With his track record, I had no reason to believe he wouldn't exploit such a situation if it benefited him. I wasn't about to risk finding out the hard way. So, I stood firm. I told him no again and made it clear that this wasn't something I was willing to negotiate. Unsurprisingly, Mike didn't take it well. His next message was laced with thinly veiled threats. He said he'd make sure everyone knew about how I had refused to help a family in need during a tough time. He even mentioned social media, painting a picture of me as the villain in our mutual circle of friends. Years ago, such a threat would have sent me into a panic. I used to care deeply about what people thought of me, constantly trying to prove my worth. But I wasn't that person anymore. I saw through Mike's tactics, and I wasn't afraid of his empty threats. What Mike didn't know was that I had a little ace up my sleeve. A few months ago, I'd installed security cameras around my apartment after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. They were high-quality cameras that captured both video and audio, and they had recorded everything. Mike's entitled attitude, his passive-aggressive comments, and even the tone of manipulation in his voice. I hadn't set them up with him in mind, but now they provided undeniable proof of his behavior. I wasn't planning to use the footage unless I had to. I wasn't going to stoop to his level. Still, it was comforting to know that if Mike decided to slander me publicly, I had the receipts to back up my side of the story. Then came the moment that solidified everything for me. Mike's story had felt off from the beginning, and I decided to dig deeper. I asked my sister for help. She had a knack for finding information online and navigating social media. It didn't take her long to uncover the truth. The story about the water heater? A lie. The tale of faulty wiring? Another fabrication. Mike had sold his house 6 months ago. The real estate listing, the sale records, everything was right there. He wasn't dealing with broken appliances or dangerous living conditions. He didn't even have a house. He had sold it and was likely couch surfing, looking for a place to stay without spending money. The entire narrative he'd spun about protecting his family and being in dire straits was nothing more than a manipulative ploy to guilt me into offering him free lodging. He didn't want to pay for a hotel, so he tried to exploit my kindness, banking on our shared history to bend me to his will. When I found out, I was livid, not just because he had lied, but because he had tried to use me. He manipulated me, all while holding on to the same smug superiority he displayed 3 years ago when he deemed me unworthy of his friendship. Now he was trying to walk back into my life as if nothing had happened, as if I owed him something. I shared what I'd uncovered with a few close friends. They were just as shocked as I was. We'd all known Mike for years, but none of us had expected him to stoop so low. The more we talked, the more obvious it became that his behavior was part of a pattern. The sob stories, the vague excuses, the insistence on not staying in a hotel, it all added up. Mike hadn't reached out because he valued me or wanted to mend our friendship. He reached out because he saw me as an easy target. My friends rallied around me, reassuring me that I had made the right decision. It wasn't just about protecting my space. It was about standing up for myself and refusing to let someone who had hurt me take advantage of me again. Mike had burned that bridge long ago, and no amount of guilt tripping or manipulation was going to rebuild it. In the end, I wasn't worried about Mike's threats. If he wanted to post about me on social media, let him. I had nothing to hide. And if it came to it, I had the evidence to show exactly what kind of person he had become. The people who mattered, my real friends, would understand. As for Mike, I didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let him back into my life. As more details trickled in, the full scope of Mike and Shelley's situation became clear, and it was worse and more baffling than I had initially thought. They had sold their house months ago, long before they had any concrete plans for where to go next. According to mutual friends, they had been overconfident about the sale, bragging about the large sum they'd gotten and how excited they were to upgrade to a bigger, more luxurious home. Mike had always liked to flaunt success, and this time was no different. They acted like they were on the cusp of their dream life. The problem was the housing market wasn't as cooperative as they'd hoped. Every house they bid on was either snatched up before they could make an offer or went to buyers with deeper pockets. It became a cruel game of musical chairs, and every time the music stopped, Mike and Shelley were left standing. Instead of renting an apartment as a temporary solution, they decided to couch surf, hopping from one friend's home to another. In their minds, this arrangement was temporary. A few days here, a week there, but as weeks turned into months, their luck didn't improve. Living out of suitcases and imposing on others became their norm. Renting, which could have provided some much-needed stability, was apparently beneath them. Shelley was particularly vocal about their refusal to settle for something temporary. They wanted a house, a permanent one, and anything less wasn't worth considering. Eventually, they wore out their welcome at too many friends' places and had no choice but to move into a hotel. I heard about it from Allison, a mutual friend who had grown increasingly fed up with their antics. Mike and Shelley weren't shy about voicing their displeasure with the hotel. They complained about everything: the noise from other families, the lack of a yard for their kids to play in, even the breakfast buffet, which Shelley claimed wasn't nutritious enough for growing children. It was ironic. They had chosen this limbo by selling their home without a plan, and now they were frustrated with the consequences of their own actions. To anyone else, the solution seemed obvious: rent an apartment until they could secure a new home. But Mike and Shelley were so fixated on their dream house that they couldn't see the damage their stubbornness was causing. As if that weren't enough, Shelley decided to escalate things by taking to Facebook. I didn't even know about it at first until Allison sent me screenshots of her posts. Shelley had written a series of passive-aggressive status updates about certain people refusing to help families in need. While she didn't mention my name directly, anyone who knew us could connect the dots. The posts were full of jabs about my lack of children, as if that somehow justified her disdain for me. The worst post, however, was a complete fabrication. Shelley claimed that a mutual acquaintance had tried to steal food from my house because, according to her, I didn't need it since I didn't have kids to feed. It was ridiculous and infuriating. I couldn't believe the lengths she was going to in order to paint me as the villain, especially considering that the entire story was a lie. Between Mike's lies about the water heater and Shelley's unhinged behavior online, the pieces started falling into place. They weren't dealing with temporary house issues. They didn't even have a house. The faulty electricity excuse was nothing more than a cover for the fact that they had been homeless for months, bouncing from place to place while stubbornly refusing to compromise. Their desperation to guilt me into letting them stay was rooted in their own poor decisions. I was frustrated, yes, but I also couldn't help feeling a twinge of pity for them. They had created this mess for themselves and seemed incapable of taking responsibility for their actions. Instead, they had resorted to manipulating and lying to the people around them, trying to shift the blame for their predicament onto anyone but themselves. My friends, especially Allison and Laura, and my sister, were instrumental in piecing everything together. We compared notes, shared information from mutual acquaintances, and uncovered the full extent of Mike and Shelley's deception. They had been stringing people along for months with fabricated stories about broken appliances and mounting medical bills. It wasn't about bad luck or emergencies. It was about their refusal to face the consequences of their choices. When I finally confronted Mike, his reaction was as predictable as it was disappointing. He tried to downplay everything, claiming that things hadn't gone as planned and that they were just doing their best to get by. But I wasn't buying it. I told him, plainly and without hesitation, that I wasn't interested in being part of their latest scheme. If he had come to me with honesty from the beginning, admitting that they had sold their house prematurely and were struggling, I might have considered helping them. But the lies, the manipulation, and the entitlement had crossed too many lines. Cutting ties with Mike wasn't easy. We had been close for so long, and part of me still mourned the friendship we once had. But I knew I couldn't let nostalgia cloud my judgment. Mike had made his choices, and now he was dealing with the fallout. He had burned the bridge between us, and I wasn't about to let him rebuild it on shaky, dishonest ground. In the end, I felt a strange sense of closure. The situation with Mike and Shelley had revealed their true colors, and I no longer felt conflicted about walking away. They had chosen to live in a fantasy, refusing to compromise or take responsibility, and they were reaping the consequences of that choice. I didn't need people like that in my life, and for the first time, I felt at peace with letting go. In the end, I didn't feel an ounce of guilt for turning Mike and Shelley down. I knew I had made the right decision, and the support of my friends only reinforced that. They saw through the lies and manipulations just as clearly as I did, and they stood by me when I needed them most. Mike and Shelley eventually moved out of the hotel, though I have no idea where they ended up, and honestly, I don't care. We don't talk anymore, and I doubt we ever will. It's strange to think about how close we used to be and how quickly things unraveled once the truth came to light. But I've learned an important lesson from all of this. Some people are only meant to be in your life for a season, and when that season ends, it's best to let them go. Mike and I had our time as friends, but that time has passed. Now I'm focused on the people who truly matter, the ones who are honest, supportive, and don't try to take advantage of others. That's the kind of friendship worth holding on to. Once all the pieces of Mike and Shelley's story came together, the absurdity of their lies became undeniable. The faulty electricity, the water heater explosion, it was all fabricated to tug at my sympathies. There were no dangerous conditions, no emergencies. The reality was far simpler and far less dramatic. They had sold their house without a backup plan, and they were now stuck in a hotel they couldn't stand, bouncing from one bad decision to another. What baffled me most was their sheer arrogance in all of this. Mutual friends shared that Mike and Shelley had initially been overjoyed about selling their house. They bragged about the profit they'd made, how they were finally going to upgrade to the luxurious dream home they had always wanted. But the housing market didn't play along. Every house they bid on was snatched up by wealthier buyers, leaving them scrambling. Instead of renting an apartment to regain stability, they opted to couch surf with friends, convinced their housing limbo was only temporary. Weeks turned into months, and their stubborn refusal to rent a place left them living out of suitcases, dragging their children along for the ride. Even after moving into a hotel, their complaints didn't stop. I heard all about it from Allison, who'd kept tabs on Shelley's passive-aggressive social media posts. Shelley complained about the noise, the lack of a yard for the kids, and even the breakfast buffet, which she claimed was unacceptable for growing children. The irony was overwhelming. They had created this mess for themselves, yet they acted as if the world owed them comfort and convenience. What really tipped me off to their manipulative tactics was Shelley's string of Facebook posts. At first, I didn't even know about them until Allison sent me screenshots. Shelley had been vague enough not to name me outright, but the posts were clearly about me. They painted a picture of someone heartless and unsupportive, someone who had refused to help a struggling family in their time of need. The posts were dripping with condescension, full of comments about how some people just don't know what it's like to have real responsibilities and digs at my childlessness. At first, I was angry, but as I read through her posts, I realized they were backfiring. People were beginning to see through the inconsistencies. Friends who had heard snippets of Mike and Shelley's story started asking questions. Once the truth came out, that they had sold their house without securing another and were now essentially homeless because of their own poor planning, sympathies began to dry up. The more I learned, the more I realized I wasn't the only one they had tried to take advantage of. Other friends came forward with their own horror stories about hosting Mike and Shelley. One family shared how they had left their home in absolute disarray after staying for several weeks. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, laundry was scattered across the guest room, and the kids ran wild with no supervision. When they finally moved out, the house smelled like they hadn't cleaned a thing during their entire stay. Another friend recalled how Shelley constantly criticized their cooking and complained about the lack of toys for her children. The entitlement was staggering. Mike and Shelley had treated these people's homes as though they were hotels, expecting to be waited on without contributing anything in return. Hearing these stories made me even more grateful that I had stood my ground. Letting them stay with me would have been a disaster. My friends' support during all of this was invaluable. Allison, Laura, and my sister were particularly vocal, calling out Mike and Shelley's behavior for what it was, an attempt to manipulate and exploit anyone who showed them kindness. Even Mike's own brother reached out to me, expressing his disgust at what Mike had done. He remembered how I had been there for their family during some of the hardest times, especially when their mother was sick. To see Mike treat me this way, lying, guilt-tripping, and trying to take advantage of me, was deeply disappointing to him. His words meant a lot to me. They reminded me that my kindness in the past hadn't gone unnoticed or unappreciated. Eventually, I decided to send Mike one final message. It wasn't emotional or angry, just direct and to the point. I told him I knew about the lies. I knew there was no faulty wiring, no water heater explosion, and no emergency that justified his attempts to manipulate me. I let him know that his behavior was a reflection of his own poor choices, not mine. I made it clear that I wasn't going to allow him to use me, and that whatever friendship we once had was now irreparably damaged. It was cathartic to finally put it out there, to say my piece and close the door on that chapter of my life. Looking back, I realized just how much trouble I had avoided by standing my ground. If I had let them move in, even temporarily, it could have turned into a legal nightmare. In our state, tenants' rights laws could have allowed them to claim residency after just a few days, making it incredibly difficult to get them to leave. The emotional and financial toll of such a situation would have been enormous. I dodged a bullet, and I had my friends to thank for helping me see through the lies. Now, as I move forward, I'm focused on surrounding myself with people who truly care, people who are honest, kind, and supportive. Mike and Shelley were a lesson in setting boundaries, in valuing myself enough to say no when someone tries to take advantage of me. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but it was an important one. In the end, I'm grateful for the clarity it brought and the strength it gave me to stand up for myself. In the end, I didn't feel guilty about turning Mike and Shelley down. I knew I had made the right decision, and the support of my friends only reinforced that. They had seen through the lies, just as I had, and their unwavering encouragement reminded me that I wasn't alone. No matter how hard Mike and Shelley tried to paint me as the bad guy, the people who mattered knew the truth, and that was enough for me. Mike and Shelley could continue playing the victim if they wanted to, but I was done being a part of their story. They had burned too many bridges, and it was only a matter of time before they ran out of people to manipulate. As for me, I had my real friends, the ones who had my back through thick and thin, and that was all I needed. Things escalated far beyond what I ever imagined after I sent Mike that final message. I thought it was over, that he'd accept my refusal and move on. I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of backing down, Mike and Shelley doubled down, and what they did next blindsided me completely. It started with more of Shelley's usual passive-aggressive Facebook posts. She had already been vague in her earlier rants, but now her insults were unmistakably directed at me. She wrote a long tirade about how certain people were selfish, greedy, and heartless. She attacked my childless life, implying that I resented their family for having children and that I was using their hardships to make myself feel superior. Her words were venomous, filled with a bitterness that was as baffling as it was infuriating. Then Mike joined in. He posted his own version of events, spinning the story to make me look like a monster. According to him, I had abandoned them in their time of need, refused to help out of spite, and even laughed at their struggles. He painted me as a vindictive, heartless person who took pleasure in watching others suffer. Worst of all, They both suggested that I had been spreading lies about their family, flipping the narrative to make it seem like I was the manipulative one. The posts gained traction, with people commenting in disbelief. Some defended them. Others were skeptical. But the damage was done. My name was being dragged through the mud, and it wasn't just personal anymore. Their lies were public, defamatory, and affecting my reputation in ways I couldn't ignore. That's when I decided to take action. With the encouragement of my friends, I contacted a lawyer, Rebecca Collins. Rebecca was sharp, relentless, and not one to tolerate nonsense. When I laid out everything, screenshots of their posts, the text messages, the testimonies of friends who had witnessed their behavior, she agreed that we had a strong case. We filed a lawsuit for defamation, slander, and emotional distress, seeking substantial damages for the harm they had caused. The trial moved quickly, largely because the evidence was overwhelmingly in my favor. Rebecca meticulously presented everything to the court. The Facebook posts where Mike and Shelley smeared my name, the messages that highlighted their lies, and the testimonies from my friends. Allison, Laura, and my sister all testified about what they had witnessed, recounting how Mike and Shelley had lied and manipulated others. They spoke about my character, emphasizing how I had always been a supportive friend, even to Mike, until his deceit made it impossible. Mike and Shelley's defense was weak. Shelley tried to pass off her posts as venting, claiming I had overreacted. Mike played the victim, saying they were under stress and hadn't meant for things to escalate. But none of it held up under scrutiny. Their excuses crumbled when Rebecca played the security camera footage from my apartment. The audio captured my interaction with Mike when he came to my door asking for help. His manipulative tone, veiled insults, and arrogant assumptions were all laid bare. The footage was damning, showing the court exactly who Mike was, a man who thought he could bully and guilt his way into getting what he wanted. The judge wasn't swayed by their excuses. The ruling was clear. Mike and Shelley were guilty of defamation, slander, and emotional distress. They were ordered to pay $250,000 in damages, a significant amount, but one that felt entirely justified given the public nature of their lies and the impact on my life. As it turned out, Mike and Shelley had the money to pay. They had been holding onto a substantial amount from the sale of their house, refusing to dip into it in hopes of securing their dream home. That dream came crashing down. The court order wiped out most of their savings, leaving them with almost nothing. They were forced to pack up and leave town, unable to face the fallout of their actions. The last I heard, they had moved to Jackson, Mississippi, disappearing into obscurity. No one from our circle has heard from them since. Part of me felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Not for them, but for the friendship we once had. Before everything went so horribly wrong, we had been close. But the truth is, Mike and Shelley did this to themselves. Their choices had consequences, and they had to face them. I wasn't the villain they tried to make me out to be. I was just someone who stood up for myself when they tried to take advantage of my kindness. In the months following the trial, life gradually returned to normal. The stress of it all began to fade, and I found peace in knowing I had done the right thing. My friends stood by me stronger than ever, and my reputation was restored. The court's decision was vindication, but the real victory was the support and loyalty of the people who mattered most. Mike and Shelley's lies and manipulations had left a trail of burned bridges and broken relationships. They had tried to twist the narrative, but in the end, the truth came out, and with it, justice.